We're recording now. Hi, welcome to the November 2nd meeting of the CNCF IoT Edge Working Group. For today's meeting, we've got, I think, 3, maybe 4 items on the agenda. Let me share the screen and open the agenda notes document and we'll take a look. So the first item on the agenda is going to be a recap of the KubeCon Edge Day event that happened last week at KubeCon. After that, what do we have submitted? We had a recap of the presentation on the Edge Native Applications principles. If somebody is here from the Eclipse group, and they usually show, maybe they'll be a little late, we'll ask for a recap of the EclipseCon event that conflicted with KubeCon, but I know some members who regularly attend this group were there. I'm going to make a brief mention of this Scale conference coming up. And if members want to add any other agenda items, go ahead and edit the document and add at the end. And we'll get to it as time allows, but we probably have a few minutes for that. If we run out of agenda items, we'll try to just switch over to an ad hoc birds of a feather like we usually do, and we'll see how it goes. So the Kubernetes on the Edge Day event was a pre-event KubeCon that lasted a full day. It had topics all over the map related to Kubernetes and Edge. Maybe I went and in the agenda notes document, I published links to decks, and maybe about half the sessions had speakers publish decks. And then the CNCF recorded these sessions. So all but one session were recorded, and the one that wasn't recorded was unfortunately one of the better ones, but it was ad hoc. It wasn't even meant to be on the schedule, but we had a couple presentations that ran shorter than expected. And we actually drafted somebody from GE Medical to come up on stage and do an impromptu kind of lightning talk that I thought turned out to be one of the better things, but sorry you had to be there. Let me just switch from the agenda notes to, this is the actual conference session document. So if you go there and click on these, this is where you go to download the decks, and you can, before you bother reading the decks, I'll just show you one. If you click here, you can get the abstract and speaker bios. And if a deck is there, this is where you go get it. The YouTube channel is up, and like I said, I think every session is there now. So you can go there and watch these live, or use your favorite tool to download these to watch them offline. And the few I looked at, the video quality's really good. So go ahead, and the topics were all over the map. So I think some people are more likely to be interested in some topics than others, but I just wanted to let you know that these are all there. The next item on the agenda, Kate, do you want to take over? We were going to talk about the session on Edge Native Applications that went on at KubeCon.
Sure, thanks. So Amar and I were able to present on behalf of the working group about the white paper we've been putting together over the past few months. And that was all around this idea of what is Edge Native, and can we define it in a way where we have a set of principles that application developers can look at and see, hey, is my application truly Edge Native, and how could I possibly change it to make it better fit for the Edge? And so our presentation was all about presenting that paper and those principles. And we see that paper as a draft. And so one of the parts of that presentation was a call of action to come to the working group, see if you'd be interested in participating in a revision or future breakout papers. And for the latter, when we were creating this paper, one of the things that came up were a lot of these sub areas where we could focus in. So for example, constrained tiny IoT device management. We tried not to put that too much in the scope of the paper, but talked about how that could be a breakout paper, or the more specific use cases of 5G on the edge. That could be a good breakout paper as well. And another part of the presentation was asking for feedback. And that was Natalie Fisher's idea. And we had a survey that we put at the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, we only have 3 responses. And so I think we might want to keep that as a running survey. So for the announcement for this meeting, I put it in the bottom of the announcements. And I think maybe that's something we continue to do, is just every time we put out anything for the working group, whether it's an email to the listserv or a presentation or anything, just keeping that that survey there so that we can continue to gather that feedback. If you are interested in giving any feedback to the working group, that is in the working group IoT Edge Slack and Kubernetes. One other thing from the session, we had a lot of good questions. I think one that was interesting to me was, and if other people attended and thought that they had any thoughts on the session, that would be great to hear too. I thought one question that was interesting is we were focused a lot on how cloud native influenced edge native. And one person had a question of how did edge native influence cloud native? And I thought that was a really interesting perspective. My response at the time was that edge native has this sense of more device awareness that now the cloud is starting to take on too, with more specialized hardware in the cloud itself, such as GPUs. But I think that's something that would be interesting to think about as a group to kind of reverse the narrative there. Did folks have any other thoughts on the session or anything they wanted to add?
There was a question about hardware security, and I think that's another possibility for a breakout paper. I remember it was, how do you secure the data on the edge device? And obviously there's a whole working group outside of this one around confidential compute. And so that's a potential area of investigation.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mark. And I think Amar kind of answered that one with the sense of you kind of have 2 paradigms of hardening at rest and hardening during transaction or en route. But yeah, we didn't really focus in on that part of security in the paper. So I agree that would be an interesting way to look at things, and looking at confidential computing on the edge is not something we've done as a working group. So that's a good point.
I also noticed that at KubeCon, there were a number of other sessions that were very similar to this. There was one, I think, by a Cisco speaker that was called Edge Native Applications, if I'm not mistaken, or something very close to that. There was at least one like on Edge Native applications at the Kubernetes on the Edge Day. And if you just go to the Kubernetes, the KubeCon schedule here, I'll drop it in the chat, and search for the word edge, you will find probably about 5 other sessions that somewhat were, I'm not going to say they were duplicates, but they were aligned with this, certainly. And I went to most of them, and it seemed to be that the things people are saying are indeed quite aligned. But if you're interested in the topic, I would advise looking at those others too. As far as I know, they're not up on YouTube yet, but some of the speakers may have made the deck available in the SCED site if you go click on the session.
Yeah, going off that, the Cisco talk that you mentioned was really good. I posted a link here in the chat. And I think it was interesting coming from the perspective of the working group where we were trying to figure out the path towards defining principles. They started with the definition of the 12-factor app and zoomed into which of those factors are particularly important for the edge. So I thought that was quite interesting. And I thought it was a really good presentation in general. And I think it did align with what we were saying too, which is also great to see, but said it in a different way, which is always interesting. Yeah, I think that was a good point. I don't think the word edge native was in the schedule at all last year. And I think it was in the schedule multiple times this year. So definitely an interesting transition.
Is there a
Yeah.
feel for which edge they're referring to?
Yeah, so that talk and ours both started with the Linux Foundation's white paper on the edge diagram of what is edge. So they were talking about the user edge, specifically smart device edge, and I can't remember what's right above that in the graph, but they have this one slide where they zoom in to what edge they're talking about, and they were focused on the user edge.
Yeah, they talked about evolving the 12 factors and 12 factors at the edge. And there's some good slides in there that were really quite talking about edge native as opposed to cloud native. There's also another presentation that I attended by Harry Lee from Velo.ai talking about going into the weeds of how they actually tackled building Kates at the edge for a industrial use case. So it was really a nice detailed field example of everything you guys have been talking about so far.
The other
These-
thing is that Edge was represented to some extent on the in the exhibition hall floor by the vendors or by various open source projects that had kiosks. And I'd say that one of the hotter topics, just like KubeCon North America last year and to some extent Europe, was WebAssembly moving down into the edge. It's a niche where I'd say more of the WebAssembly is not edge related per se, but a lot of it is. And, there were definitely people there. I haven't had a chance to look at the WebAssembly Day agenda, but I know in past events, there have been a couple of edge related presentations there. So I've been meaning to go look, but I was unable to attend that myself. If somebody was there, maybe they could mention whether anything edge related happened there.
I can give a recap of the day. I don't remember anything specific to the edge. The day was really focused on evolving the ecosystem in general. So it started 3 of the 8 main sessions were about developments in Java, Python, and C# to make it more fully featured for WebAssembly, both in the browser and outside the browser. And so really about developing what languages people can use with WebAssembly. Several of the sessions were about the upcoming changes to the WebAssembly ecosystem to enable code sharing and reuse. And that's through the WebAssembly Systems Interface, or WASI, is governed by the Bytecode Alliance, and multiple companies of all sizes, Amazon, Microsoft, Fastly, are all working together to define something called the component model, which is helping with, and registries, which is helping with this code sharing and reuse. So it's focused on that. And then Docker had a couple talks about how they're participating now in the WebAssembly ecosystem. And then beyond that, I don't remember WebAssembly specific, Edge specific talks for WASM Day. I'm going to quickly peek at the schedule just to jog my brain. But those were the kind of the bigger themes. And to point to Edge, though, the CNCF put out their community survey for their WASM community survey for the first time this year. And one of the questions was, where do you see yourself using WebAssembly currently or in the future? And the number 1 response was the serverless space, but the number 2 response was Edge, while the 3rd response was web development. So the CNCF community is definitely interested in Edge. And I think that was like 60% of people said Edge. So definitely good to point that out, Steve. And those recordings are out as well, just like Edge Day.
Okay, let's move on. Is by any chance someone here who attended the EclipseCon? Okay, if not, I am just going to show you the, I'll share my screen again. And this is the webpage for EclipseCon. Let me just paste a note to this in the chat right now. And I went and looked, and I've done a search on this for the word edge, and it looks like a number of these talks come up. And this is just it. The top note aligns it by day, so it lasted 3 days, but I think I randomly clicked on one, and it looks like it gives you the abstract, and you can download the slides to this deck. So it looks like this might be worth taking a look at and poking around to see if you find anything interesting. And I don't know what the plan is for making these available on video, but the Eclipse Foundation sponsors some number of edge-related projects that are well into the double digits. So I think this is likely to be worth taking a look at for anybody interested in edge. And maybe at a future date, if you go look at this, find something interesting. Frederick is a frequent attender of our meetings. He's just not here today. It could well be that he's taking some time off after a conference or traveling back, but here it is for what it's worth. Then moving on, I'm an organizer of this SCALE conference that is a Los Angeles-based open source conference that now you'll see the title here is SCALE 20X. So next year will be the 20th occurrence of this conference. It actually started literally in some college students' dorm room at USC. They were people who liked Linux in the early days. So originally this stood for Southern California Linux Expo, but it's since expanded well beyond just Linux and covering all of open source. This has become the largest community-driven open source conference in North America. Before COVID, this was reaching attendance of 4,500 people. And it's a somewhat unusual conference, very non-corporate, fairly large numbers of student attendees, as well as children. In fact, one of the most unusual aspects of this conference is that it goes Thursday through Sunday, but on Saturday, the conference itself has a special track reserved for under 18 years of age presenters. And there are also sessions targeted at teaching kids under 18. So on the weekend, it's common to see people bring their whole family. And at the end of the day on Saturday, there is actually a kids' game night with some really good prizes given out. It's also a social event for adults that has an adult game night on Saturday that goes, I don't know, I've usually been there till midnight. So it's kind of a fun event, and it's open for CFPs now until, I believe, December 2nd, but until early in December. There's a large number of tracks which could be attractive to this group. One of them being cloud native, where you would fit anything running in containers as well as under Kubernetes. There's also a track labeled developer. Embedded would arguably cover some sorts of IoT edge. And this track would often get right down into hardware and people doing hands-on projects with drones, Arduinos, things like that. There's a general catch-all. There is a topic labeled home automation, prosumer, and IoT. Some of these other things like observability could fit into edge. Open data is the concept that any data paid for or collected by public agencies should be required to be open access. It arguably is more of a political spin on tech, but there have often been some really interesting sessions there. And in fact, I presented on that track myself on occasion. We've got open government. Another one that could be considered edge related is open medical. And this is the concept of using open source in medical devices. Also security, systems and infrastructure, ham radio and Linux. So I'd encourage you to submit to this event or to attend it. If you've got any questions, like I say, I'm an organizer, so I'd be willing to help coach anyone who's thinking of presenting here, or if you wanted to co-present and looking for co-presenters, maybe I could help find some sort of alignment. And I don't know if anybody here has ever attended. I give you a moment to give an honest review of the experience. But looking at the names of who we got today, as far as I know, maybe nobody has attended Scale in the past. Okay, I'll take that silence to mean that probably nobody here has attended Scale. So let me see if there was anything else on the agenda notes after this. Next item we've got is the white paper. What's next? Maybe I'll turn this back over to you again, Kate.
Sure. So I think we had a big push towards getting our draft of the white paper out for KubeCon. And I honestly am very grateful that we had a talk that was kind of our deadline for that, since it pushed us to have something out there. This whole what next, I was curious, is there another place to place the draft that we want to go outside of GitHub? Did people want to put that on some sort of publication or blog? That was one of the questions that we've discussed in the past. Another was, is this a draft or is this a full-on version? At what point are we happy to say that it's no longer a draft? And the third being kind of related of, do we want to continue working on it? And what are the areas that we want to work on with it? And so I know people from the paper are here. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd be curious.
Do we want to continue working on it or start doing add-ons to it? Like being more specific around a particular principle, for example. Because,
Yeah.
sorry, I was just going to say, because I kind of see like this white paper sort of as like the, I guess, the top level. And then if we continue to kind of go down this track of writing or working on the white paper, then we would be a little bit more specific and maybe a little bit more detailed on the different principles that we basically kind of gave an overall view on.
I think that it was good that we targeted the conference, but it did get a little rushed, where I think that this is definitely in the draft stage, and with more time and attention to detail put on it, it could get better. But it was clear that as we went through this process, the attempt to keep this concise, meaning 6 pages or less, caused a lot of material that we were coming up with to be left on the cutting room floor. So I think enabling spin-off detailed papers was something we talked about, and there's no reason that we can't put these additional reference documents out there as drafts right away, so that we have a home for composing the more deep dive drill downs into specialized areas that the white paper is an outline for. So that's my opinion, that we should have no objection to people who want to propose spin-off details that branch off into more detailed coverage on things outlined by the white paper. Just go for it.
So it sounds like the call for action for that is, as a whole working group, we settled on these 9 principles, and that creates a foundation for any working group members on their own, in pairs, whatever, to create their own draft and present it to the working group, or to create their own draft of any spinoff or focus of it and present that to the working group at any meeting. Is that kind of the idea, that we're set on working on it maybe as a group, and We've created the knowledge base for folks to kind of create those one-offs and share that with the group.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good procedure to just self-enable people to go off and do drafts. Ultimately, I think it has to be reviewed because this is going to be viewed as sort of an officially sanctioned thing coming out of a CNCF working group. So the idea that some people would go off unilaterally, compose something and publish it without review is probably not appropriate. But, you know, as often happens, even in open source code, people have to go do the work and submit it. And it should be looked on as others because the whole principle of this as part of the as part of the community standards is that this is looked on and vetted for conflicts of interest and things like that. We particularly don't want aspects of this to be a mechanism for commercial advertising and things like that. But, you know, I'd say what Kate said is outlined as a plan is a good way here.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand as well, so basically we kind of want to just work any kind of spin-offs the same way we worked on this first white paper, where someone kind of starts it and then shares with the group, and then we all kind of look at it and vet it and or review it.
Yes, I'd say that if you want to start one of these spin-offs, just compose something and let us know either in Slack or in the meeting agenda that it's done, and maybe give us a quick demo and reach out to see who else might want to participate, and we'll take it from there.
But it sounds like you also think we should continue to update and maybe quote unquote perfect the original white paper as well, since we did kind of rush it towards the end.
Yeah, I think so. I believe we're labeling this as a draft so that there isn't a declaration that this is the final version.
Sounds good to me.
And Kate, one of the other things you brought up is whether we wanted to publicize this a bit now that we've got it out there. I personally would say yes, as long as, you know, we are clear that this is still in the formative phases and this isn't like a view of a final polished document. At some point, I think we'd even potentially try to get the steering people of the CNCF itself to recognize this more prominently, but maybe we're not ready for that yet. I've been approached by a few people who maybe could help us in that, you know, some people who blog or are associated with the press. So I think we might have some opportunities to do this, you know, going forward. Maybe we want to take a step at collecting feedback we got after the presentation and polishing it up just a little bit before we move on to seeking publicity. And we probably got a fair amount of attention just by virtue of going out there with KubeCon. And maybe we can wait until people who weren't able to physically attend catch up on the KubeCon videos and things. And, you know, as the attention wave from that starts to go down a bit, we can start a second wave of publicity, perhaps.
When we do get closer, another area that I could also help with is I am working with Newsstack to actually do some other articles. Maybe another area that we might want to think about posting this.
Okay, that sounds
when we're
good.
Closer, when we're closer to or when it's more finalized, but yeah, it's something that I can talk to them about.
Yeah, in fact, maybe if you're getting started on forking off some more deep dive things, if we had one or two of those available to talk about too, you know, to indicate they're in the formative stages and we're open to other people joining in on this effort, that would help, I think, make it a more full-featured story for something like the Newsstack.
Yeah, that sounds good. Because like right now, the stuff I've been working with them, the Newsstack on, it's been more like Edge. I'm not Edge, but ML at Edge. basically more around machine learning. But like I said, this is something I can definitely pitch to them as well.
And I'm wondering, as we spin off some of these focus groups, if we should maintain a list of what they are. That probably would be a good idea, but I'm not sure exactly where we put it. I guess we can worry about that on a future meeting as we get a few, but it might be nice if people had a place to go to see if, to discover if they were interested in a niche area, whether a group had already formed in such a niche area. Maybe kind of even a member list of people interested in particular focus areas would be useful to form, subgroups of people with shared collective interests.
Yeah, I think for starters, one thing we can do is make it a regular agenda item that if you're working on a spin-off paper, kind of announcing it at the beginning or end of every working group meeting, and we can have that documented in the notes. And then we could even, like you were saying, in the future, formalize that more into a formal document. This is going back to a little earlier, but I think the feedback part is something that I'm personally craving a lot for our draft. Like I mentioned earlier, we didn't get a ton from the form. And so I think understanding what it means to have a final version of our principles, our original white paper, would be really helpful. And I think feedback is kind of a precursor to that. So I'd be curious for folks on this call if any of you all had immediate feedback on it. And of course, that's putting you on the spot, but finding a way to get that feedback would be helpful regardless. If anyone has ideas on that, of way we should distribute the draft in a way that's productive for feedback.
Are we looking for just additional markup or just what we want next on the existing white paper? So is it just like impressions and opinions, or, well, we could go into more detail in this section?
My response would be both, but even
Okay.
you can be even more critical and say, I don't agree with this principle. I don't think this should be there. Or it could be, I think you're missing a principle. So it can be tweaks, elaborations, and full-on revise.
Okay.
A few things I'd suggest to get feedback. I confess that if there was a form or a survey, I haven't done it myself, being at KubeCon and giving talks. I just was fully busy and wasn't doing any of the collateral stuff, but make it easy to find. So if somebody happens to find the white paper, I'm hoping there's a way where the survey is right there in their face, like maybe added onto it. The other thing is, now that the video of that presentation at KubeCon has been published, I believe that, I don't really know if the CNCF opened it up for comments or not, but that's an option when you publish on YouTube. But if it does allow comments on the video, maybe you can add a link to the form as a comment so that somebody who watches that session in the recorded form will discover the survey. Like I say, I'm not sure if you can or not, but if you can, that seems like a good way to approach it. And I don't recall if you streamed the link to the form in the Slack channel or not, but that would be another good place where it belongs.
Yeah, I did put it in the Slack channel, but that does remind me we could put it out in the email newsletter, because we do have that. And I think that reaches a broader audience. So maybe we send out something about announcing the draft of the white paper and asking for feedback.
And I don't know, but in my experience, maybe you already did this, but whenever I put out a survey, I find you get better results if you tell them how long it will take in advance. Like, will you take this 2-minute survey? Gets better response than will you take this survey? And obviously that depends on it being short. Hopefully it isn't like a 40-minute survey, because that could be an issue. If it's super long, people just don't,
It's
people
like
just start them and
2 minutes.
abandon them.
So it's like a 2-minute survey, depending on how slow you read.
Okay, yeah, but I'd suggest tell them it's 2 minutes upfront because that helps a lot in my experience. I know for me personally that makes me far more likely to click on that link.
It does say it on the survey itself, but if we're gonna do it with a newsletter, then we should probably just add that right before the link to the survey.
Okay, great.
So it seems like this was our last agenda item before we can do a birds of feather and kind of just discuss, but just to track some to-dos that we had. It sounds like we have a to-do to send out the newsletter or send out the white paper to the newsletter. I'm willing to do that. And then we have a to-do for Natalie to talk to the news stack that might be later on when we're more formalized. And okay, great, Natalie. Yeah, I'll reach out to you about with the newsletter, sending that out. And did we have any other to-dos that I didn't capture from that discussion there?
Yeah, I don't think so, other than, anybody here who's interested in going into deep dive spin-offs to the white paper or going on a second pass of tuning the white paper, if you want to
Yeah.
add that to the to-do or not.
I'm definitely going to do a full review, read through, and do some notes and commentary, potentially even potential rabbit hole white papers on topics that are subsidiary. So
That's awesome. I'm excited
yeah, fresh eyes always helps.
for sure. And just so you're aware, the white paper is on GitHub, but if you want to leave comments through a pull request or anything of that sort, that's might be the best way, even though that's a little hard. You're muted, Mark.
Yeah, I trying to find the white paper actually was a little bit of a chore. So that's one thing that I'm going to try and figure out how to make that easier, because I actually have to go to your presentation and click on the link in the presentation to find it. So
I can post one right in the chat now. But maybe this is a bad thing that I even have to ask, but is this HackMD list now considered the authoritative?
No, we're on GitHub. We're merged on
Okay.
GitHub. And I think part of this is our switch from being under Kubernetes to being under runtime. It can be harder to find our information in general. But yeah, some sort of publication with the news stack might help with that too, as the source of truth to get to the paper.
Okay, I think at this phase, we're out of agenda items. Anybody who wants to add one right now verbally, just go for it. And otherwise, we'll switch to just kind of a birds of a feather. Anybody's free to shout out anything they found interesting, cool, anything you want to talk about that you saw. If you went to KubeCon that was interesting in a booth after hours or in a session, just go for it and we'll chat. If the conversation doesn't reach till the end of the hour, we'll just terminate the meeting early. But generally, people find something. So the microphone is open.
So one of the things, as a newcomer to the group, one of the things I really appreciated about the group's work and presentation at KubeCon was it reassured the field practitioners that how we're approaching Edge. You helped validate what we're doing in the field and how we're looking at Edge, because before seeing your presentation, the question I had coming into KubeCon is, are we doing things right? right? What's the rest of the world? How are they looking at this? And I was really pleased, and that's why I wanted to join and, help the working group. So my impressions from KubeCon were really about what are others doing in the space. And as we discussed earlier, there's other presentations like the Cisco presentation that was really helpful in, being able to, not only put a lens on this, but also corroborate the working group's draft paper. And so it was really nice and refreshing. So glad to be here and help.
One of the things I was encouraged at KubeCon, kind of in a hallway track, was even what percentage of the generic KubeCon attendees were interested in Edge. And this comes from my experience of just at the lunch break, sitting at some random table with, complete strangers who were just there for the event. And pretty much even these big enterprises that started out with landing Kubernetes in the major public clouds have use cases they're looking at for also running things out at edge locations. I can't think of any group that I sat down with at lunch when I say, hey, I was here starting the week for the Kubernetes on the Edge day, and they came up with things that they had going on at Edge, maybe early formative stages. But I was really encouraged by the percentage of Kubernetes users that actually view this as something where, hey, Kubernetes is stable. We clearly have things going on, moving workloads to the public clouds with Kubernetes, but we're also looking at cloud native applications at Edge. Now, to be honest, I think some of these people are maybe questioning whether what they have going on at Edge is best suited for Kubernetes or Kubernetes plus other forms. And we've talked about this for well over a year now, whether, for some sorts of resource challenged edge applications, maybe Kubernetes isn't the best solution, but it could fit on in a tiered deployment of technology, maybe at a higher level gateway tier or something, even if the actual edge leaf nodes are running bare metal containers or something else. But I found the conference overall to be pretty encouraging as to the future of Edge.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna say that's super nice to hear. Because I was also gonna just add some color to that too. I've been having a lot of customer conversations with customers like P&G and Chevron and Lumen, and they are all looking to deploy to Edge, and they're all very much at the beginning stage. So it's going to be a really interesting transition for the next few years.
It is. One of the most interesting conversations I had was with the chief metallurgist for General Dynamics big gun bore division. And he came here to learn more about how they can do metrics and observability at the edge. And that really means getting, data sensors and collecting those data sensors from, tiny devices, Raspberry Pi or Arduino level, work units and up. And so when we start to look at how Edge is evolving, it's a really interesting problem because some of my automotive customers are also looking at with their Kubernetes challenge is how much compute do they have at the edge to be able to do things. And I really appreciated that geographical picture that you guys put together to be able to help dial in and understand that.
Yeah, I think the Kubernetes on the edge problem is really interesting. And it's part of the reason why as a working group, we moved out of Kubernetes and into CNCF. And I think we're in this space where Kubernetes is such a brand that's so trusted that vendors want the Kubernetes solution for everything, but it doesn't necessarily fit for the edge. And so people are working on that and trying to find ways to slim it down or reframe what control plane means. But I am also very curious as to whether Kubernetes will withstand that, or if we'll find a world where you can have Kubernetes in the cloud and that's connected to some other standard orchestrator for the edge. And you can still be proud of your Kubernetes solution, but that only exists in the cloud. I think we're at an interesting point for sure.
Yeah, I'm really glad that this group ended up able to get to the tag level, because I was thinking about that too. Because I've talked to a lot of customers, and like some of them are like, oh, we don't really want to use Kubernetes at the edge because it doesn't really work for us. But I've had some that are trying to transition into, but I also feel like because they're at the beginning stage, they're technically not really sure. Like they're just trying to figure it out. And they haven't figured out all their environments. And just to kind of like hop onto what Mark was also saying, I do think it's going to be really interesting to see how all these variety of edge deployments are going to be sort of managed, because that's another space that'll need there will be challenges.
Yeah, edge orchestration is going to be a
Yes.
new topic that we're going to hear more and more about, because I've had customers trying to put Kubernetes at the edge with remote worker nodes.
Yep.
And that was absolute overkill when all they needed was a CRI with a node port.
Yeah, like that's what I'm talking about too. Like that's exactly some of the orchestration component of it. It'll definitely get a lot more interesting too. And like I said, I'm working more on the ML side of edge, but I'm also seeing a lot of interesting transitions with different accelerators at the edge as well, and how that will also be orchestrated. So I'm working on a few projects there around inferencing and model training.
Yeah, I think people are seeing challenges not just related to the orchestrator, but maybe even the container runtime too. Like, is Docker the best container technology, or is maybe, I think it's so early days for WebAssembly that it might be 5 years, but there are clearly people doing things with WebAssembly or WASM that look like they have nice attributes for edge applications. The other one
is one of the open source products that's doing that, where they are looking at, they're using WASM for neural networking to kind of look at and how they're going to do that, and kind of on the WASM form, because that's another space that I'm also looking into and exploring as well.
And then the other thing is related to your communications channels, where the edge isn't like a public cloud, where you've got excellent connectivity that's very reliable with a lot of redundancy. And some of the tools that people are used to using for networking in Kubernetes in a public cloud end up getting pretty challenged out at edge locations. So that, you have to ask yourself, if you've got a leaf node, whether you really want to stand up an ingress, a load balancer, and whether you want that edge location to actually be running an open port and listening, even if it ran an ingress on some very low resource hardware that could be easily knocked down by denial of service attacks. One of the talks I gave on Kubernetes at Edge Days nominally was on running a home lab, but one of the things I've fallen in love with in my home lab is running an outbound only tunnel to a CDN and having that be my point of presence, rather than trying to invite connectivity right to some sort of a NAT on a home router. That just, in a home situation, I'm a skeptic on the idea of running Kubernetes like networking. And I think by association, this could apply to a lot of edge applications, that the standard Kubernetes way of doing things maybe isn't the right way for low resource edge.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
Is there general interest in exploring applying this on constrained devices?
Applying what, like tunnels, or Kubernetes like things like load balancer and ingress? I think the answer is both, because I've seen people do it. not necessarily with uniform success, but it's, like I say, it's early stages and people are kind of trying everything. And one of the interesting aspects of groups like this is you do get feedback from people who went that direction, dipped their toe in the water, and are giving reports on how it turned out.
To Rob's point, I think if we're going to be talking about the edge in perpetuity for a little while, I think we do need to explore constrained devices, because the categories of what an edge device is, varies based on use case. It could very well be a Raspberry Pi, or it could be a full pizza box, in a telecom rack, right? So I think the use cases that we see range from all of the above to multiple pizza boxes. And so I think part of that picture in your presentation, Kate, really is really good, but I think there's potentially a angle on compute constraints, and that could be a whole page. Yeah. And of course, there's my vacuum complaining it's stuck. Sorry.
The use case I'd be interested in exploring, if people are interested in joining me, would be using a C or Rust-based kubelet running on some of these devices. And to the comment you made, Steve, stripping away things that you don't need at the edge, like maybe even orchestration, and just using the control plane aspects of Kubernetes in order to schedule workloads onto some of these small devices. It's things that we've been exploring and researching for a while now, but I'd like to sort of open it up to a wider audience if other people are interested.
Rob, I think some of these versions of Kubernetes, like Cube Edge, Super Edge, OpenYurt, actually do involve, or at one time did involve, modifications to the kubelet and kind of what I call a stretch control plane, where at an edge leaf node, they're attempting to declare that to be a Kubernetes single cluster node, or maybe they were even running a handful of worker nodes there with the control plane up in a public cloud. And you'll find some projects went that direction. And the reports I hear is that it works well if the connectivity to the cloud-hosted control plane is relatively good. But if that becomes something that is intermittent by design or by virtue of frequent failures, that does present some challenges. And kind of the original design of Kubernetes was that you would pool centralized, more or less heterogeneous resources into a pool and have the scheduler move workloads to it. When you invert that to an edge thing, you have to ask yourself whether you've sort of are causing the Kubernetes scheduler and design to be morphed into something it wasn't optimized for. Right. In other words, once you care very much that this workload needs to go to exactly this location, say you get to a cardinality situation where one workload, one exact instance of the leaf node that it's allowed to run on. You can accomplish that with taints, labeling, etc. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself whether the Kubernetes scheduler is your friend or something that you're effectively just more or less disabling. There's no right answer to that, but I've heard some people who came to the conclusion that at the end of the day, maybe they were better off just deploying a container runtime engine at those edge locations and coming up with a different thing to model it. There have been attempts to find custom resource definitions in Kubernetes so that you could still use the Kubernetes control plane to manage it, but technically they're not Kubernetes worker nodes.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about IoT devices that operate in isolation, that makes way more sense because you're not over-engineering the problem. The challenge is when you start to have devices working together and you need that single orchestrator of workloads across devices, you ideally want the same control system for your compute edge devices as well as your far edge devices that are very resource constrained. So I'd be very interested in finding out what other people ran into. But the problem I'm trying to look at is having that single control plane that applies across different size of edge devices.
Yeah, that is a challenge in design, and it's always going. If we look at the like Stephen had pointed out, is that the original Kubernetes control plane design, it was never designed with the edge in mind. It was always designed with a pool of resources, and so we started looking at the etcd communication requirements and response times. You can fine tune those to, really, small latency, but any hiccup in that, and you may have some problems on your hands. And so when we start to look at network, it really becomes the network constraint as well as part of the resource constraint, because if you're not able to communicate back to the control plane, either because of resource constraints or network constraints, those are the two dictating principles that we look at from a design, whether or not you can do remote edge workers, or if we can actually have to get away from Kubernetes altogether and just do some form of a CRI working on some operating system.
Yeah, a few other challenges I'll throw out there, public cloud versus edge, are even the scale. Kubernetes really was made to scale up to 5,000 cluster nodes. I think, as far as I know, I haven't looked at the spec, but I think it's still 5,000. And there are edge deployments that are way over 5,000 edge nodes, hundreds of thousands. Now, granted, you could go with multiple Kubernetes clusters, but even if you do that and break them into 5,000 node increments, Kubernetes at 5,000 nodes is actually really at an upper limit. I believe people find that their etcd doesn't necessarily scale linearly in terms of the demands for just keeping your etcd healthy, and that you might have to go up to 5 node, 7 node etcd clusters. And if you then needed multiple Kubernetes clusters, that thing is going to have a pretty big appetite. The other concern is, what do you do at these edge locations when they perhaps they're in different failure domains for power? So they power cycle, and maybe they power cycle and everything doesn't come up quickly or maybe at all. In other words, the internet connectivity is down at the moment they recover, or access to things they're using like image repositories is down. You walk yourself into something where you're saying, okay, if I have to anticipate being able to tolerate loss of internet connectivity intermittently, I have to run air gapped. So that means I have to stand up a local container image registry. By the time you get there, more and more resources are being duplicated up at these edge locations and gobbling up resources. And this can be a slippery slope that isn't real attractive.
Right.
I don't know a universal solution, but I'm just telling you, people have gone that way and discovered that the water wasn't a comfortable temperature.
Yeah, so that's the third rail, or the third angle on this. We have network constraints, we have resource constraints, and now we have failure domain constraints. And those three things are going to dictate how you design your edge, and the polar opposite, how you design your clusters that are going to support the edge. Are you going to do, like you said, Steve, if you're going to do 7 node, etcd central cluster, or do you go crazy and do Submariner, which is cluster of clusters to support your 20,000 or 30,000 edge devices? Again, sometimes Kubernetes doesn't solve the edge problem. It's now you're pigeonholing a design choice into the solution. So yeah, I think those three things are going to potentially dictate, like a spin-off article or document that Rob was talking about.
Okay, at this point, we're 3 minutes after
Yeah.
the hour, so I think we're going to have to call it quits here. But as usual, the birds of a feather discussion got kind of interesting, and we'll resume again in a couple of weeks. Thank you, everybody, for attending. If anything else didn't get covered, just bring it up on the Slack channel. So thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.